KJV, the NLT, the NIV, the NASB, the CSB. I could go on with all the acronyms and the words that are pronouncing acronyms, but what I'm doing is I'm giving you different Bible translations. And these are questions that come from people who are not in church, most of whom have never been in church, or in some cases rarely are in church. And they ask questions. Like in the last episode, we said, what do you do with the Bible in a church? Why do you carry a Bible? I'm not going to go into that one in this episode, but we're going to continue to look at the theme of the Bible because we want to be able to answer these non-churchgoers' questions. And this question is not only asked by those who are not in church, it's often asked by churchgoers as well. Here's the question from those who do not attend church. Why are there so many different Bible translations? And, I often keep up with the top 10 Bible translations in the English language. That just gives you an idea how many there are when I'm keeping up with the top 10. And I look at those and I see what the preferred one is. Just a little bit of bias on my part. I love the New Living Translation, the NLT. That is my preferred translation. But it begs the question again. Why are there so many different Bible translations? Well, I'm going to give you 4 reasons. It's not exhaustive, but maybe these 4 will help you. Reason number 1, the English language changes, so the translations do. Just think about some of the new words that have come along in just the last 5 years. Think about the ways that in the English language, and I'm not even talking about translations beyond the English language, just all the ways that things have changed. What means something 10 years ago and what it means today, what means something 20 years ago. We have to change the translations or at least update them because the English language is changing. You may have heard, and again, I'm focusing this on those who do not attend church. You may have heard the King James Version Bible. Now, what is the King James Version? It was written in the 16th century. And so there's a lot of language like thee and thou and shout. And you read it today and you just say, I cannot make sense of it. Now, for those of you who are KJV readers, with apologies, I'm just saying, even if you are a King James reader, you have to say that's not the way that the English language is communicated today. And so that's just an example that's a few hundred years ago. But even translations that were written 10, 15, 20 years ago, the English language has changed. And so at the very least, they need to be updated because the purpose of a translation is to communicate what the Bible said in its mainly 2 languages, Hebrew and Greek. There's a bit of Aramaic in it. But to communicate those languages where we, and I'm talking English language, where we who understand the English language can get it not only in the translations, but in our own vernacular as well. So one of the reasons is the English translation is changing. The second reason is there is no single authority who determines translations. There is not this person sitting somewhere on a throne. That might be a little bit extreme, but there's not this single authority that says, you shall have this translation and everybody has to have it. No. Publishing houses decide translations, denominations decide translations. There are different reasons why there are different authorities on translations. And so that's why one of the reasons you're not going to have a single translation is because, well, frankly, anybody can decide to do a translation, and how well it's done, the critics will let you know one way or the other. But there's no single authority. And if you don't have a single authority, you are obviously going to have multiple translations. A third reason, many denominations and publishing houses wanted the freedom to publish their own scripture without getting permission from other translations. You may not know this, but in many of the translations, King James would be an exception because that's public domain, but in many of the translations, if you want to repeat so many verses, and each translation has its number, you have to get permission for that translation or for that part of the Bible to be printed. Like, for example, you do a book and you want 500 verses from a certain translation. Well, the likelihood is you're going to have to go to the publisher to get permission to do that. And here's the thing about it. Many of the publishing houses wanted their own translation, and for good reason, but so that they would not have to go back and forth when they did their own translation to get permission from another publisher. That's not a big reason, but at least I need to put it out there. That's one of the reasons that you have so many different Bibles. Now, this fourth one is the one that you commonly hear. And if you're not keeping up, let me summarize where we are right now. English language changes, and so the translation changes. There is, secondly, no single authority who decides what the translation is. Third, many of the publishers of different translations wanted the freedom to have their own translation where they would not be limited or have to get permission to quote scripture. Fourth, this one is the most common. It is what is often called translation philosophy. Translation philosophy. Let me give you an example. When the USA Today first came out as a newspaper, it decided, I may have the grade wrong, but if I recall correctly, it decided at its original publication that it was going to be on the 6th grade reading level. In other words, an easier reading level. Now, so it wrote its newspaper. I think it's even come down to younger since then, but it wrote its newspaper in such a way that most everybody who is literate could read it. So the USA Today had its own philosophy. We're going to make it easy reading. Well, translation philosophies are all over the place. First of all, some people say that the two extremes of translation philosophy are one, literal and paraphrase. And I guess that's fair. But let's talk about a paraphrase is not really a translation. A paraphrase, like the Message, which is a paraphrase that is out there, just summarizes the scripture. It does not go in and try to reflect accuracy word for word, or even phrase for phrase, or sometimes even sentence for sentence. Literal, I don't know if there's such thing as a truly literal Bible, but the most literal Bible tries to translate word for word. So in the Greek, which is the New Testament, they try to go from the Greek to the English word for word. Hebrew, word for word. The few Aramaic, word for word. And you say, well, that's the best one, isn't it? Because you're translating every word. Not necessarily so. Literal does not necessarily mean the most accurate. The most literal is not necessarily the most accurate. Why is that? Because sometimes when you are reading something word for word, it just does not make sense coming from one language to another. And so some translations philosophy say we're going to do phrase for phrase or sentence for sentence. And therein lies the differences. Some that are very literal, often called wooden, some that are very loose and to the extent that they're paraphrases. But then there's a lot of them that don't do the literal of one to one, but they do it in a dynamic way. It's often called a dynamic equivalent, where they're translating a full sentence or a full phrase. Now, this may be confusing to you because it's confusing to me even as I'm hearing it come from my mouth. But this is one of the reasons that we have so many translations. Some people want the most literal translation. To my knowledge, in the English, the most literal translation is the New American Standard Bible, often called the NASB. I don't prefer the NASB, especially for preaching or teaching, because many times it's difficult to understand the word-for-word translation. As I said, the NLT is my favorite translation. I love it for its accuracy, and I love it for its readability. And it's accurate because it's communicating in a way that maybe when the Bibles first came out in their manuscript, the early listeners of it heard it in their language the way that we're hearing it as well. So let me just go back to the original question. I kind of got bogged down in this translation philosophy. Why are there so many different translations? One, English language is changing. Two, there's no single authority that decides what's the translation. Three, the freedom to publish your own scripture without having to get copyright permission from another publisher. And four, translation philosophy. How literal, how dynamic equivalent, how, in some cases, paraphrase, even though I would not put paraphrase in the category of a translation. Hope that's been a little bit of help. Hope I hadn't muddled it up too much. We always want to thank Cheney and Associates. Thank you, Steve, Thank you, folks. And your firm is truly the accounting firm for the church. Hey, you heard it in the bumper, but if you need bookkeepers, just understand why 1,100 churches have chosen Cheney Associates over the past 21 years to do their payroll and accounting. So thank you for this one. We got one more from those who don't attend church. This one may generate a little bit of interest. Why is there gender imbalance in church participation? If that got your curiosity up, stay tuned. We'll already have this one available for you. As soon as you click off this one, you can go to the next one. We'll see you and hear you and be with you in the next episode.